And I will ask my questions in English if possible. Jerome, what trade-offs do you see between low and stable inflation and economic growth, specifically in Ukraine, if there is such a trade-off? And if there is such a trade-off, whether the monetary policy is today appropriate? And what is the experience of other countries? And this is perhaps a more important question for us. What can we learn from other countries in similar situations about the trade-off between economic growth and trying to create a credible policy of the bank and other institutions that combat inflation? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I would like to come back a bit to what we have seen in terms of inflation and macroeconomic stabilization. First, as it was said, it's really important for Ukraine to continue on the path of macroeconomic stabilization and what has been achieved, in particular in terms of inflation. Now, as I mentioned earlier, when I refer to the experience of before 2014, essentially, I want to come back to that a little bit because I think it also helps to explain the situation that we face now and the prospect that we see. In many ways, what we were seeing before was a set of illusions, right? There was an illusion that prices reflected the real situation, that people were paying the right price for things. There was an illusion that Ukraine could import a huge amount of gas. Now today we see that actually Ukraine doesn't need to import so much gas. There was an illusion that the financial sector was properly supervised. But it was not the case. I mean, there was a situation where the central bank, even at the time, didn't even know who the owners of the banks were. I mean, how can you supervise the banking system in such a situation? So there were a number of illusions that we had, that we saw at the time. Of course, it's very difficult to dissipate those illusions, and it's very painful as well. So we have seen, the reason why I'm bringing this is that we have seen a strong adjustment in the level of prices as well. I mean, and that reflected the adjustment in the exchange rate that we have seen, which has been a painful one. That has reflected also the adjustment in some administered prices. And now, indeed, gas and heating tariffs, for example, are much closer to market rates and to the reality. So that coming out of these illusions is an important aspect. And there are some trade-offs, indeed, and it's not always possible to achieve all objectives at the same time. I think what we see now is that we have a central bank which is both a much more independent central bank and a much more modern central bank. And that's, that has very practical consequences. That means that we have a central bank which now is able to conduct some analysis, to have policy initiatives, to have some ownership of the policies. That makes a huge difference. So I think what matters a lot is the extent to which the central bank has transformed itself and is on its way to essentially be able to bring not only a lower inflation, but inflation which is also in a way more predictable and more forecastable, if there is such a word, right? No, I still think that the primary objective of the central bank, of course, should be to maintain low inflation. As we see, and again, coming back to this illusion, we have seen situations where there was low inflation. In 2011, 2012, we had low inflation, right? But this, again, was reflecting an illusion and a reality where essentially the prices were not reflecting the reality. So now we are in a much more sounder basis, both because we had an adjustment of prices and also because the central bank has much more capacity to forecast. There are a number of areas where some progress needs to be made. For example, in order to come to a proper inflation targeting regime, there's still some progress to be made on how we understand the monetary transmission and how monetary policy is transmitted to prices. But I think it's quite important that the central bank will bring the stability and continues to bring the macroeconomic stability and the predictability, which is very important for investors as well. Now, on bringing higher growth, that's primarily the task of the authorities. And as we discussed before, there are a number of areas which are, some of them, and actually a lot of them are outside of the remit of the central bank. They need to, including improving the business environment and so on.
Okay, so I understand that there is a trade-off potentially, but if I may sum up, the priority is actually to remove these illusions and to create a real central bank and a real policy and real inflation targeting, and then we can
which is happening to some extent.
Which is happening, and then we can talk about the next steps, rebuilding the economy and sustaining the economic growth. I have a little bit of sort of question along the lines that some people in Ukraine, not me personally, but some people disagree whether the IMF should play such an active role in helping with structural reforms in particular. What would be your answer to those people?
Well, you're asking several questions in one, in a way.
That's
so, one is whether we should be helping at all, and I guess the other one is whether we should be helping on structural reforms.
That is
more specifically, right? No, I mean, for us, we are in a way a land of last resort. So we are here to support countries when they find no other way, essentially, to finance themselves. But importantly, we are a lending institution, and we are a lending institution that is here to support the proper economic policies. Not only because the only way for a lending institution to be repaid in such a context is to make sure that the policies are sustainable, but because we also have a mandate to promote growth and macroeconomic and financial stability over the world. So that being said, of course, it is always we have a role where we can provide advice, where we can help the authorities come up with policies, and to some extent we can also convey some messages. For example, on the agenda on anti-corruption, we work closely with civil society to come up with potential solutions and policies that we could reform, we could support. So we have this role also of impulsing to some extent. And as I mentioned before, and the analogy that I used, in this difficult path and going upward on this hill, sometimes we help to push the car, but we are not the driver necessarily. We just stand behind and help in difficult situations. But that means that there is also a limit to that. That means that essentially we, as an institution, can help and support reforms, but we need also a strong political will, without which not much can happen over the long term and over some period of time. And we need to have a discussion with policymakers who have an ownership of the policies. I think that is also why we had such a successful dialogue with the central bank since 2014, that we have a real partner which can come up with ideas, with policy. We have a real dialogue based on facts, based on numbers. And just to illustrate this further, for example, we and other donors have an important program of technical assistance, which is provided to the central bank. But that can only, and we can coordinate between donors and so on, but that can only really work if there is a true ownership of the policies. And essentially where there is a team in place which will conduct the reform, where there is a strategy, where there is a timeline. So that's the only way it can work. And unfortunately we would like to see this in other areas, but just that's an illustration also, I think that.
I see.
And maybe just a last point. We are indeed involved on structural reforms. We cannot deal with all the issues, partly because it's not necessarily the core of our mandate or our expertise, but in some cases, and in particular in cases where we are engaged with lending provided over the medium term, there are some medium-term issues that need to be tackled. And again, as I mentioned before, the only way that we see to have high and sustainable growth in this country is essentially to bring structural reforms and to do it as soon as possible. Because some of the impact of these policies is felt, there is some painful impact sometimes. There are a lot of political economy issues. Because of course, the first, sometimes that in some cases you hurt some vested interest, so to speak, but the impact shows up later. So that creates a whole set of challenges, and it's something that we see in other countries as well. Now, in terms of structural reforms, the emphasis is different depending on which countries. For example, in the euro area, a lot of the emphasis of structural reforms was on labor market issues. Right? Here, it's obviously a lot focused on improving the business environment and in particular dealing with corruption issues.
That's correct. Thank you. We are falling behind on time and I would like to move on, but I still want to circle back to the beginning of the question, of the first question I asked. And if you can provide a real quick answer, and I will rephrase it a little bit, yes or no, and the sentence, that would be extremely grateful. And the question is, using the international experience, what can Ukraine learn, in particular given your remarks? Do we have a chance to succeed if there is no political will? Are there international examples where the country succeeded despite insufficient support from the top?
So your question is whether there are examples of countries which can succeed without political will?
We're not talking about Ukraine. Are there examples of the other countries where reforms were successful despite lack of the support from the top?
Lack of support of donors or lack of political will?
Political will. Insufficient political will. Some political will is always present.
I mean, if you look at all, I mean, over the medium term, there is no doubt that you cannot succeed, one country cannot succeed if there is no political will. So that is pretty clear. If there is no political will or no ownership of the policies, you cannot succeed over the medium term.
All right. Thank you very much.